אנו מכריזים בזאת
Hello, I'm Barry Shaw, and this is The View from Israel. One of the satisfying things that I do as part of my work in public diplomacy for Israel is to come across what I call selfless heroes, people who pick up the issue and dedicate their lives, their livelihood, their money, and their soul to shine the light of truth on a particular issue. People that amaze me by their commitment and dedication in exposing the Israeli truth against a tsunami of lies, deceptions, and anti-Israel propaganda. And I'm delighted to say that I have one of those heroes as my guest today on the show, David Bedein. Welcome to The View from Israel.
Thank you.
All right, and David, you established way back in, I believe, 1987, the Center for Near East Policy. It's a research camp, and you serve as its director. Now, I also understand you're also an author of a book, Roadblocks to Peace, How the United Nations Perpetuates the Arab-Israeli Conflict, UNRWA Policies Reconsidered. And this book documents your 35 years of investigative journalism, focusing on the activities of the United Nations Relief and Works Agencies in the Middle East. So, David, first of all, tell the audience, what is UNRWA?
UNRWA, this is the book. It's available through Amazon, Roadblock to Peace. And you'll see here the entrance to the Ida camp, 28 meters from the fence to Jerusalem. This is here you have the symbol of a keyhole and a key, because every Arab thinks they're going back to where they came from in 1948. UNRWA was established by the United Nations just after the 48 war as a temporary operation, 59 temporary refugee camps until everything could get sorted out. Well, what it was 500,000 Arab refugees in 48 is now 6.7 million Arab refugees, still in 59 temporary refugee camps. What got me into this issue, in 1968, shortly after the Six-Day War, a sociologist met my class. I was in 12th grade at Akiba Hebrew Academy in Philadelphia, and he said, you know, we have a chance. The Jews have a chance after the Six-Day War to settle this issue of the refugees. They're using this as a pawn. Now let's resettle them. Let's get on with the issue. Well, so I came to Israel in 1970 and made it my passion from then until now. And as Barry mentioned, in 1987, I did something professionally with it. I joined an agency that had been running, by the way, since 1952, the Center for Near East Policy Research, and we moved it to Israel. It became under my directorship. And ever since, we've been conducting studies of the UNRWA camps, studies of the right of return mantra, which has become right of return by force of arms for the Arab refugees, and how this thing has been perpetuated, and how 300 organizations, half of which are governments, maintain the UNRWA as it is, as a temporary agency, with every Arab who lives there believing that he's going back to where he came from in 48 by force of arms. Now, this is not something people pay attention to. People pay attention to the PLO, to Hamas, to wars as they happen, but not to the underlying issue, which is what motivates people to fight. And just the past few days, someone made a suggestion that where Arab villages used to be in which are now Israel should be demarcated. Now, if that happens, then the Arabs have a place where they're going to attack. There's a tsunami of misinformation out there which says to the world, oh, if we just give them West Bank, Judea, Samaria, everything will be fine. Except that's not what they're asking for.
Now, I want you to point out the strange fact is that there is a separate United Nations refugee organization for the rest of the world, and one exclusively for the Palestinians. Tell us about the other one and why the dichotomy.
The United Nations High Commission for Refugees, also known as the UNHCR, functions for refugees around the world. Their agency was started a half a year after UNRWA was founded for the rest of the world. The Arab world, which pushed the issue of starting UNRWA, by the way, it was a Swedish initiative by Count Bernadotte, who was a Swedish mediator, who pushed the issue of UNRWA and giving the Arabs their right of return, since the focus of the first Israeli law was the right of return for the Jews. So we wanted to balance it off. Now, the UNHCR, the idea would be, I gave a speech at the United Nations Correspondents Association many years ago and say, why not replace UNRWA with UNHCR? Except that would require a General Assembly decision. What can be done, however, is that the donor nations to UNRWA can say, hey, we want to function like the UNHCR and work on resettlement, rehabilitation, a future. Right now, the only futures offered to the refugees, the descendants of refugees, is to take back the lands that you left in 1948. And that's supported by every nation in the world, and even Saudi Arabia, which is offering some kind of some new peace initiative. Saudi Arabia is one of the prime funders of UNRWA, together with Germany, Sweden, and the UK.
Well, my reading is that they're perpetuating a completely separate and, as I said, exclusive refugee agents for the Palestinians, instead of, after decades and decades of wasteful money and finding some of the things you're going to expose on this show, instead of integrating it into the global refugee organization, they keep on perpetuating it. And I think my take on it is they're doing it simply to use it as a political weapon exclusively against Israel.
A political weapon and a military weapon. We cannot dismiss the fact that when the KGB, which gave the life to UNRWA in the 1950s and 1960s, envisioned it as transforming themselves from a refugee issue into a national liberation issue, the language that was used at that time with Vietnam and with everybody else. So the concept was to make it into, again, right of return by force of arms. And that's what's accepted. Every nation in the world is part of it. The only nation to pull back a little bit was the United States. In 2018, partially using our material, the Trump administration cut off UNRWA completely. And this past year, something else happened which is even more constructive. The Biden administration, whether or not they're pro-Israel is another question, but the Biden administration said, you want further funds for education? You'll have to revise your education and have your education consonant with ideas of the United Nations of promoting peace. And when the UNRWA refused to do that, guess what? They didn't get their money. The UNRWA money from the United States right now is in escrow, and every nation in the world could make that demand. So far, that's not happening.
Well, one of the main purposes of the other International Refugee Agency is to ensure the safety of the education of refugees and reduce their numbers, which is completely the opposite of what the UNRWA organization is doing. And I want you to talk about this issue based on your Bedein Center for Near East Policy Research just published a report by Dr. Arnon Groys. I think the title was, does the UNRWA educational system prepare Palestinian children and youth for war against Israel? What were its findings and its conclusion of your report?
Dr. Gross, at our request, reviewed more than 1,000 school books, which UNRWA had received from the Palestinian Authority. We made that request because we met with Guterres' staff, that's the head of the United Nations staff, 5 times, personally, and they said the thing to do is to get the donor nations to adopt a different idea, different principle. First of all, to see what's there. Now, on August 1st, 2000, UNRWA began using the new books of the Palestinian Authority, which were supposed to be for peace. Except we found they're not for peace. Not only are they not for peace, but there's specific lessons on how to take back your homes from 48, how to emulate a woman who conducted a terror act on the coastal road, how to draw maps that have no Israel, how to take every Arab city, a Jewish city, and give it an Arab name, how to prepare yourselves to take back all of Israel. Now, again, this is what Dr. Gross's findings are. You can see his work. We have a new website called unrwa-monitor.com, UNRWA-monitor.com. Take a look for yourself. I was asked by the Reform Movement to provide them with books for peace that the Palestinian Authority produces. And I'm sorry, but we do nonfiction, not fiction, and we could not comply with their request. If we had found one book of the Palestinian Authority which promoted peace, which was used by UNRWA, we would use it. They went so far as to invent the idea that the UNRWA was teaching the values they learned from lessons from the Holocaust. What we did know, and we did find out, because I personally visited the Palestinian Authority Curriculum Center when they were updating the books in 2007. In 1997. I went there with the staff, and we saw that they were taking passages from descriptions of what happened during the Holocaust to the Jews and applying it to the Arabs, saying that, for example, when the Jewish officers came into Arab villages, they killed the husbands, took the wedding rings off the women, and conducted a number of slaughters. That's what they call the Nakba. There's a whole generation, an entire generation of Palestinian Arabs who know about the Nakba, know about the relocation of Arabs from 48, have no idea that 5 Arab armies invaded at the same time. By the way, that goes for the Jews too. There is a whole world of ignorance amongst Jewish students, even in Israel, who have no idea that Israel was invaded by 5 Arab armies, and this is one of the things that contributed to the relocation of Arabs from who moved out of there while this invasion was happening. So this is all what we found. We have all the books on a website, the website in Arabic, which we've supplied to the United Nations and to all the donor nations who should know better. But the attitude, as a matter of fact, we got some very strange responses. Germany, which is the biggest funder, the ambassador gave an interview about our work. She was very upset. She says, "I do not have time to go over David's books." David's books. That's the way she put it. Germany is the most egregious example of a donor to UNRWA, which ignores what goes on. What's most important is we have a German staff here, and we've discovered that 9 different agencies, 9 different foundations from Germany are the prime funders of UNRWA today. And all of these agencies, whether it be the Friedrich Ebert Foundation or the Adenauer Foundation and others, they do wonders for Israel, but they're also helping terror groups inside UNRWA, which are associated with the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Germany is the prime mover on education, which basically promotes genocide. Germany.
We're going to put up on the screen a number of maps and other parts of evidence of what they're teaching in the school and what the truth is. For instance, I want you to talk about, for instance, we can put up on the screen what we call the legitimate original maps of what the boundaries of Palestine were. That I'm referring to the ones that were drawn up both at San Remo and the League of Nations. And in fact, the maps in the country maps that are being taught to Arab kids in UNRWA schools about what they see as the map of Palestine, where Israel doesn't exist. Can you talk about a little bit about that?
It's not complicated. What they do is they take the maps of all of Palestine, saying it's all Arab, and that's it. San Remo, there's a whole world that doesn't know about the San Remo conference in the early 20s. There's a whole world that doesn't know about other instances where there were even Arab acceptance of Jewish life. What's interesting is that the Palestinian map put out in 1948 shows the Palestinian Arab map shows Kfar Etzion before it was, of course, massacred. But the 14 Jewish communities that were destroyed in the 1948 war, it's as if they never existed. But that's all part of the story. The whole story is one story and one story only. Now, it's not only maps. I want to be very clear about something. This business of wiping out any negativism amongst the Arabs, Tel Aviv University has an annual survey of anti-Semitism around the world. And on our site, UNRWA-monitor.com, you'll see our studies of anti-Semitism in their education system. Well, this year, Tel Aviv University decided not to have any mention of the Palestinian Authority or of UNRWA. We asked, we weren't dealing with that part of the world this year. In previous years, they downplayed it. This year, they wiped it out completely. So it's not only a matter of maps or flags, it's a matter of a whole systematic effort to deny what's going on inside the Palestinian Arab entities. And everyone is very enthusiastic these days about the fact that Saudi Arabia is becoming closer to Israel. No one's asking, why is Saudi Arabia continuing to be one of the prime funders of UNRWA and UNRWA education? And UNRWA provides military training in the summer for their children.
In my opinion, David, one of the results of miseducation of Palestinian Arab kids and youth is that when they go to higher education, as they're doing, for instance, in Birzeit University, you end up with a student body, as happened a month ago, where they voted in the Hamas wing of the student body in Birzeit University. And just pointing out to our viewers who may not be aware of it, Birzeit University is not in the Gaza Strip. It's about 8 kilometers, 5 miles north of Ramallah, the seat of the Palestinian Authority, where Mahmoud Abbas sits. And part of that... Go ahead.
I'm sorry to disrupt mid-sentence. Birzeit University was commended by Shimon Peres, the former foreign minister and prime minister, for developing a peace curriculum, which, by the way, was ignored. There is very little, there's all kinds of mores here in Israel and elsewhere. You can't attack anything in the West Bank. You can't attack Arab education. You can't attack Abu Mazen. And that's all this is part of the problem.
I didn't know Shimon Peres' involvement in that, but if we're talking about UNRWA schools, there's something else that you covered. They took a coin made by Palestinian Jews in 1927. They scrubbed out, they erased the Hebrew on that coin to present this fake coin as if it had been manufactured by the Arabs in 1927. We're going to put that on the screen at a period when the Arabs thought it was an insult to be called a Palestinian. In those days, an Arab was an Arab and the Palestinians were the Jews. Talk to me about that a little bit.
Well, this is even more, it's more egregious than that. The new school books of the Palestinian Authority used by UNRWA, we're talking about more than 1,000 books, overwhelm the children with the idea that there is no Jewish connection to Jerusalem, that the Arabs were the people who started Jerusalem, were the founders of Jerusalem, who put together Jerusalem, and this is all part of the story. It's not only, and the fact that there's a guidebook written in 1925, when the Haj Amin al-Husseini, the notorious Mufti in Jerusalem, was in charge of the Muslim Council, talking about the Temple Mount and the Jewish connections to Jerusalem, that goes by the wayside.
And also that in the school books, we're accustomed these days to say that the Temple Mount isn't the Temple Mount of the Jewish temple, but it's strictly and exclusively a Muslim holy site. But in the school books, they don't even call the Western Wall, what used to be called the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, as the place that the Jews go to pray, having ceded the Temple Mount to the Arabs, but they call it the Barak Wall, named after a fictitious animal that supposedly in a dream had taken Muhammad in the middle of the night to what they call the Far Mosque. Well, the Far Mosque was never identified as Jerusalem in the first place originally, only much later.
Okay, well, that's exactly the point. And it's not complicated, the issue. Whether the donkey was fictitious or not is not the issue. The issue is that anything holy to the Jews in the land of Israel is all of a sudden put by the wayside. When I came to Israel 51 years ago as a student, and I got involved with this issue right away, and by the way, I started asking, because I told you a sociologist I met in 1968, before I came to Israel, I said, this is the solution. We have to get on with this. Right away, I started meeting with people from the Israel Foreign Ministry who said, oh, the Arab refugees, they're great for cheap labor. That was their vision, cheap labor, nothing beyond that. But here you have an issue of a revision. When we met young Palestinian Arabs at the time in Jerusalem, in the old city in Jerusalem, and we had a lot of dialogues, there wasn't anyone who didn't know that, number one, that Israel was, that any Jews were not allowed to come into the old city of Jerusalem on pain of their life. Number two, there wasn't anyone who didn't know that the Arab refugee situation was created because of the 1948 war and the invasion of 5 Arab armies. They all knew it. They all wanted to discuss it. Today, Now, by the way, when did the Nakba start being discussed? The issue of the relocation as the relocation of the Arabs as a symbol. It started being discussed in 1998. As I mentioned, in 1997, I had the opportunity with my staff to go into the curriculum center of the Palestinian Authority, where they were revising the curriculum and making the issue of Nakba the focus of their education. Why? Because they had a real crisis. After the 1993 accords that they reached with Israel, which, by the way, were never ratified by the Palestinian Authority, a little detail, but after there were starting to be too many people amongst the Palestinian Arabs who were ready to reconcile themselves with Israel. So what Arafat decided at the time, and he said it very clearly, we have to emphasize the Nakba, how we were kicked out in 1993, and how the Jews in 1947, and how in 48, and how the Jews have no rights here. Now that's not something which, by the way, there's a very, very important distinction I make between the Palestinian Arab people and the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was given the opportunity to run things by Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin. The Palestinian Arab people, they're people who want to get along with us, who recognize, who appreciate the fact that they're here. You know, that's one of the, when we were as young people, when I was only 20 years old when I came here, I met people my own age, 1970. And they told me horrific stories about the Jordanian presence here, which was, by the way, an occupation not recognized by anyone except for Britain and Pakistan. And they told me a horrific story. I was involved at that time with student theater projects. They told me what happened to their student theater in 1967, in April 1967. They tried to perform in Nablus. They didn't have also in Shechem, they didn't have a license to do so from King Hussein's security forces. So they got on the stage and shot them. Started killing because they were having a theater program without permission. So they were so pleased. The Arabs in Jerusalem were so pleased to get rid of Jordan, and they're so pleased to operate in a free atmosphere. That's something they very much appreciated.
From reading some of your work, that the Arab schoolgirls are being taught to lionize a woman called Dalal al-Mughrabi, and she was the female leader of a Palestinian terror group that hijacked a bus on the Israeli coastal road and then slaughtered the people there. And yet they glorify her as somebody to be revered. And now in their school books, what I want you to address is it ends in Arabic with a provocative question: what should be done with the surviving Jews after the liberation of Palestine? I want you to address that issue.
This is very important because in one of the school books that one of the prime books of this Palestinian Authority, there's a song which we found it in 50 different YouTubes, that we shall liberate the land, and anyone we find that is still alive, we shall exterminate, using the Arab term for exterminate, very, very clearly. Now, I don't want you to believe this is the book. This is a school book for fifth graders, literature school book, and it's these books are very well put together. And you see here a picture of Dalal al-Mughrabi, who murdered 35 Israelis, 35 Jews on a bus. Before getting on the bus, she slaughtered a American Jewish photographer who was on the beach. And there's 4 pages here which go on to discuss her life and her legacy and how every Arab child should learn about her. Now, I want to be very clear about something. They're saying, oh, that's a Nazi book. No, it's not. The Nazis, we've had 4 experts come into this office, including the late Robert Wistrich, who came in and looked at our books. The school books of the Nazi Germany did not glorify the murder of Jews at any time. Someone recently showed me a 1936 book from Nazi Germany, because someone who lives here and he's from that period, he saved the book. So, well, with the Jews, you just have to, you just tolerate them. They're vermin, but tolerate them, and the government will take care of them. We now know what that means. But the point is that here you have a school book, and it's not the only school book, which glorifies the murder of Jews. You find me one donor to UNRWA. There are 67 countries that give money to UNRWA. Not one will ask that this book be removed. Not one. Why? We took our job seriously. We met with at least a dozen diplomats who financed the Palestinian Authority school books, and we said, we'll go through all of them. there was only one diplomat to give us credit and to approve of what we were doing and to sing our praises to the donor nations. That was Archbishop Pietro Sambi, who was the Vatican's representative in Jerusalem, who made the Palestinian Authority school books an issue for the Catholic Church to take up. I was supposed to appear with my staff together with Archbishop Sambi in September of 2011, except he died 2 weeks before that, and that's one of the regrets that a gentleman like that would die young, unfortunately, of lung cancer.
David, I want to get into the issue is how you do what you manage to do, because you obtain obviously the school books, but you also know about their agenda, and you also go into some of the camps, the UNRWA camps and the schools, actually to film a lot of the kids and have them quote from their own mouths how they feel about the issue of a Palestinian state, how they feel about the Jews, how they feel about the existence of living alongside a Jewish state or not. How do you manage to do all of this when you're virtually a single-handed organization?
Number one, we have 4 PhDs working with us who know Arabic fluently on the PhD level, all with degrees in Islamic studies. We have 6 Palestinian Arab journalists who help us out. And the other thing we have to do, we have to raise money. In other words, it's a very lonely experience to do all this. I can't do it myself. I don't pretend. There's some Jewish organizations who take our work and show it. But if you don't have someone who speaks Arabic next to you, you have no credibility. So we have credibility because we have our Dr. Gross is the head of the team, and Palestinian Arab journalists love to work with us. First of all, we pay them very well, and if they make one mistake, they're out. But we produced 28 movies and 42 studies of the Palestinian Authority and UNRWA, of their school books and of their education, and we've done this over a period of 33 years, and it has not been easy because we have a lot of people who are trying to say they're there for peace and don't worry about it. Ironically, when Shimon Peres said that our videos were maybe concocted, maybe there was a problem, a journalist asked Yasser Arafat about them. He says, they're all, I appreciate what David Bedein is doing because I want everyone to know what I'm saying to my own people, to which my wife said, does everyone have to know who you are? But anyway, this is also very clearly an appeal to help us out. On our site, unrwa-monitor.com, we can show you how you can send cash over to help us out with our work. We're hoping to film their military summer camps in the summer and all year round. But many people don't want us to do this work because it upsets the apple cart of the illusion of a peace process. I want to be very clear. If there was a peace process, I am a veteran of the Israel peace movement.
Part of your campaign is to crusade basically among donor countries. Donors, I'm not talking about to you, obviously we're more, but to UNRWA, for instance, and for them to impose the reforms in UNRWA facilities based on the evidence that you bring them of your research, both the books and the movies. Now, I know that one of them, you participated in an informal panel at the British House of Commons with experts, if I call them that, on UNRWA education. Tell us about your visit to the British Parliament. Did you come out of that with a positive or a negative impression? And where else have you been in Europe and other places in order to expose what's going on?
Our agency has been at the Bundestag in Germany, the Swedish Parliament, the Canadian Parliament, the US Congress, and the British Parliament. In all places, we were received very, very nicely. But the bottom line was there was no change in policy, except from the United States, where there was a change in policy. But I forgot to mention that in 2009, the Canadians pulled their funds out of UNRWA as a result of our appearance in the Canadian Parliament. But then when the new guy came in, Trudeau, they were restored. And that was based on the fact that we proved that UNRWA was being run by Hamas staffers, and they didn't change. Just that, and since then, after the Canadians put back their money, we said, let's come back to the Canadian Parliament and show the truth. Well, we weren't invited back. And when we were in Britain, we've had 4 times in the British Parliament, but too many Jewish organizations were bothered by what we were saying and didn't want us to come back. In Germany, we met with 9 different political parties, but not with Merkel's office. Who didn't want to meet with us. In Sweden, we had a very, very good response, but again, Sweden says we should rely on UNRWA mechanisms of criticism. So that's a very short summary of what's going on.
The full knowledge about what's going on, why do European governments and charities still pump vast amounts of monies into this system of indoctrination with no precondition for this UN agency to stop this anti-Semitic indoctrination? And it's a precursor, this educational system, to an eventual continuation of terrorism.
There is no country in the world that knows what's going on. Simple. I mean, we succeeded to an extent with the United States and to an extent with Canada. In Germany, it's not known. The fact that we've had some success with 9 political parties listening to us, no. There's 12, as I mentioned, 9 different German foundations helping out. They do not know, no one is willing to bring us back to Germany to make presentations. No one's willing to bring us back to the UK, to Canada, to Sweden to make presentations, and that's the story. There is not the knowledge is very, very marginalized, and the fact that there have been reassurances from the Israel's peace movement that there's a peace curriculum. By the way, we met the people at Arizona University who created the peace curriculum, and they said good news and bad news. Good news is it exists. The bad news is you're not allowed to. No one's allowed to use it. Getting that point across is very difficult.
I'm disappointed. I'm saddened that despite your efforts, you're now telling us that there's really no a change or demand that, in fact, that UNRWA changes its agenda or its school books. What does it take for this to happen?
What it takes is the money to promote this issue in the proper places. The European Parliament, for example, is very positive about our work. The European Union is not. The European Union makes the decisions. We'd like to be able to make a weekly presentation at the European Union in Brussels. We'd like to make a weekly presentation at the Bundestag in Germany, and that takes money. You find anyone who's willing to pay for it. Anyone.
I want you to address another matter, because the Palestinian education minister, Dr. Marwan Awatani, was supposed to attend a European Union Parliament meeting in April here on the textbook incitement, but he backed out at the last moment. And despite initially calling for a hearing and agreeing to the EU supervised debate, he refused to take part in it. So what can we do when you have a European Union wanting to address this issue and the education minister of the Palestinian Authority refuses to attend?
Why do we have to depend on the Palestinian education minister? Of course he won't attend. Of course he won't help out. So can we have someone take the initiative and bring our experts? We've got 4 experts. We'll bring them anytime. They know languages, not a problem. To Brussels. We can do it on a regular basis. Find me someone who's willing to do it. That's all. It's not complicated. We can contradict them at any time, and we can expect that the Palestinian Authority, which works under the aegis of the Palestine Liberation Organization, is a whole generation that does not know that PLO means Liberation Organization. They stand for war. There's a whole generation that does not know that Arafat and the PLO never ratified the Oslo Accords. Pinchas Bari, journalist from the left-wing newspaper Al Mishmar, back in 1993, 1993, he went to the meeting of the PLO where they were supposed to approve the Oslo Accords. They never did. But this has been pushed over. The legacy of Shimon Peres is to try to put all this thing put out to pasture. And when Peres became president, the Peres Center for Peace, which still exists, unfortunately, still emphasizes that point. Something called the Geneva Initiative, promoting peace, except for one thing. The Geneva Initiative is funded by the Swiss government. At their initial meeting, December 1st, 2003, I was there. I was the only journalist who would not take a subsidy from the Swiss government to attend the Geneva, the founding of the Geneva Initiative. If you don't conform with the policies of Switzerland, you can't be part of the peace initiative, and you're certainly not allowed to present these school books. No one has allowed us to go to the Swiss Parliament and present these school books. No one, and the Jewish organizations are scared to do so.
I understand. I think he was a European parliamentarian by the name of Lucas Mendel, if I got his name right, who's the vice chairman of the Security and Defense Subcommittee, and I quote him here because it's important. On as a result of learning about your work, what's going on UNRWA, he said, and I quote, "Hatred breeds hatred, violence and worse, and we should have learned that by now. And it is shocking to see that once again these educational materials, these meaning in UNRWA schools, propagate hatred. It's no case should we be spending EU taxpayers' money, and that's absolutely mad." I think possibly as a result of that the EU have slashed their UNRWA budget by 40%, but I understand that you're not impressed. Why?
No, it's a joke. The EU slashed by 40% because of what's going on in the Ukraine. We met with Dr. Gross and I met with the EU here in Israel. We met with their representatives, and they were very clear. They're giving a 3-year plan of $246 million with no restrictions whatsoever, no changes whatsoever in the curriculum. That is a joke. The reason why there's confusion because people confuse the European Parliament with the European Union. The European Parliament recommended sweeping changes, and the European Union said no. That's all. And people were impressed by the European Parliament and thought that was the issue. That's not the issue. So they start. So as a result of our request to come to Brussels with this material, there's no. It's been taken care of already. It hasn't been taken care of.
A couple of pieces of good news that I picked up just prior to coming on air and talking with you. One, for instance, which surprised me, the United Nations ambassador for the United States, Linda Thomas Greenfield, was recently pushing back on anti-Israel activity at the United Nations, particularly, she said, UNRWA. And she raised concern about the anti-Semitic and anti-Israel content of education material sponsored by UNRWA, mentioning both the UNRWA leadership and the PA that prints out the school books. So I think the work that you're doing is starting having an impact. And the other piece of news was actually the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, David Bedein, spoke up and said that the United Nations must recognize Jews from the Middle East countries as refugees, because if they want to perpetuate Palestinian refugees in perpetual, how about including the 850,000 Jewish refugees from Middle Eastern countries and having the same status as the Palestinian refugees, if you want equality, most of which, including the Palestinians, are into their 5th generation. There's no great Nakba over the suffering of 850,000 Jewish refugees from Arab and Muslim countries. So if people want to help you, want to get your books, want to donate to your work, where can they reach you? UNRWA-monitor.com is the best place to find it. Also, our book, we have 2 books, one which is Roadblock for Peace. The other is a book called Genesis of the Palestinian Authority. But we're registered through tax-deductible donations in Germany, the UK, Canada, and the United States. And I'm available. Some people don't want to be, how shall I say, many people are intimidated, don't want to be publicly put their names down that they're sending money. They can be in touch with me directly. I can show them how to make anonymous donations. My website, my email is dbedein@israelbehindthenews.com, but very easy to find what we're doing, dbedein@israelbehindthenews.com. Very pleased to work with people. We've survived for 33 years. Most of our donors are private, anonymous, because of a certain fear of getting involved with what we're doing. But all I can say is the other side has no problem. The Arabs have no problem revealing for themselves what to do. Now that because of the era of Zoom, let's just say that we can do Zoom conferences. We can show our films on Zoom.
We can bring our experts on Zoom, and some of the Arabs will also speak on Zoom very openly. So this is in a democracy, agreement is not essential. Participation is. That's an old Greek proverb, which is very applicable to what you're saying now. We have to let my people know. That's one of our expressions. And I can just say that I'm encouraged. I wouldn't, at the age of almost 72, having been involved with this since I'm 19 years old or 18 years old, I'm always encouraged that we can go on and do what we do. And there's some people who will listen. And we're trying to get the policymakers. We also get a lot of encouragement from the head of the United Nations, Mr. Guterres, who feels that he's embarrassed on the record, embarrassed what he sees from UNRWA. And he's encouraging us to go to all the donor countries and present the facts. The other hero is Gilad Erdan, Israel's ambassador to the United Nations. A series of UN ambassadors had not raised the issue, and they took the school books of UNRWA and placed them on the docket of the United Nations. So he was encouraged, and I don't know how many speaking tours he was refused because most there's no Jewish organization, with the exception of the Wiesenthal Center in the U.S., who will raise this issue. So there's an atmosphere of intimidation, but what can I tell you? That's part of the deal. But thank you, Barry Shaw, a man of courage who is not afraid to work with us and to let the truth come out.
Well, I would like to encourage the Jewish organization, Christian organization, pro-Israel organization, yes, even human rights organizations, or peace organizations. If you really want to get an aspect that you really don't know about, invite David Bedein, invite Dr. Gross, take his material, invite him on a lecture tour, have a conference on the issues over here, and learn and educate yourself, and then have you put the pressure on your government and your authorities to either stop the funding, stop the funding of UNRWA educational systems until you could be convinced that they're teaching their next generation to a future of peace and not a world without Jews or without Israel.
I'm going to mention one more statement that this should conclude our discussion. In the beginning of July, 30,000 children from UNRWA will be going through weapons training. We can film that. We need the support to do it. And then as we've shown from last year, the concept of the UNRWA child soldier, despite United Nations laws and resolutions against arming children, seeing is believing, and we need a few people with courage to finance the filming of UNRWA children being trained with automatic weapons, and without any regret on their face, without any hatred. Automatons will say our job is to murder Jews.
Simply put, viewers, the United Nations have a unique and exclusive refugee organization for the Palestinians. They have an educational system, which you've heard in this program, is not teaching Arab kids for a future of peace alongside Israel. They're teaching them and training them for a future of terror and war against the Jews and a world without Israel. And this is being sponsored not only by the United Nations, by European governments and other charities, and goodness knows who else. This has to stop. I want to thank David Bedein. I want to bless David Bedein for the holy work that he's doing. He, more than anybody, is the real peacemaker. And you can't have any peace before you eradicate the hate education and the hate indoctrination. I want to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for listening. Please share this video. Please make contact with David Bedein and his organization, and please support him. Thank you very much. This is Barry Shaw, The View from Israel.
Thank you.
אנו מכריזים בזאת